right, you ready for your whiplash?
Bring it.
So last night we discussed how the Bible presents God as disappearing from the world. And now we take this leap back in time to a time when God seemed very present and real to the Israelite people, to David. And so what is this psalm all about? It's a rather violent psalm in places. It talks about the defeat of his enemies. By the way, what piece of liturgy is in this psalm?
Torah service.
The Torah service. Let God arise and his enemies be scattered. First thing we say when the Torah comes out of the ark. This is also considered to be an anti-Canaanite psalm. So in other words, it's basically stomping all over the Canaanite religion, taking aspects of that religion and saying the God of Israel is the real God, and that Baal and the Baalim are not. That God crushes the heads is a immediate affirmation that our God is a God who saves, who rescues, he comes, and that he has power even over death is very important. And that's one of the reasons why in the Amidah, the second section is all about the power of God over death. We'll find out why that's important. So, what is it that the psalmist is wanting to have a person who hears this psalm? What does he want them to come away with? Is it the words and the thoughts and the understanding? Or the passion and experience of the cosmic conqueror being before them? I think it is the latter and not the former. It's not concerned with reason so much, it's concerned with experiencing the all-powerful and mighty God, and to know the terrible, awesome, and fearful, fearsome, threatening being who is the one who is the master of creation. This psalm is excessive. It is violent. And it is also progressive. So the theophany is when God appears in history in some fashion and accomplishes something which is dramatic, extreme. And this leads us to think about the future and what the coming of God would be like in the future. If one takes biblical patterning to be one's interpretive lens, then one would say that God will appear in the future as he has in the past. And by the way, we said that I said last night that God was disappearing from the world, but he also reappeared real recently. Very similar to this psalm. Anybody want to venture when he reappeared as the cosmic conqueror?
Revelation 19.
No, we ain't there yet. If you want to take that as being a Now you're going to have to fit that to history. So you think about how you want to fit that with history. Speaking of this, some historical events. So one of the things that God is doing in this psalm is He's talking about bringing His covenant people into the land and settling them there. It's part of His great power. So in our times,
He has done
God has returned His people to the land.
Exodus.
Also, in the 6-day war, His hosts were present. And the reason I say that is because the Egyptians, when they were asked why did they flee, they said it wasn't the tanks we were afraid of, it was what was over the tanks that we were afraid of when they turned and fled, when they outnumbered the Israeli tanks. So God has reappeared in protection of Israel in modern times, very much as the cosmic conqueror. When you look at the videos of the war and you look at all the machinery and all the men that came against Israel and how Israel come out victorious, it's just amazing. So the purpose of God's coming in the Exodus was to bring His people to a new place of covenant and relationship. So the path of God's conquest in our lives then ought to follow the same path. And this path is something that can lead us along and be a teacher for us. So, we're going to try to dissect this psalm. And I'm going to ask you to look at the various parts of this psalm as we go along. By the way, there's another piece of liturgy that we do that is very close in its nature to this psalm in terms of the conquering aspects of God and His ultimate purpose. Anybody think of what other piece of liturgy besides the Torah processional where this psalm, the Aleinu, God will come to be the ruler over all the earth, and all the nations will come and bow down before Him, that every knee should bow, etc., and so forth.
So Paul bases his comments in Philippians on the Aleinu, I guess, huh? Philippians 2.
Well, the question is, we would have to go in and ask the question about the Aleinu and its development and when we thought the Aleinu was actually developed as a piece of liturgy. So there are some things that we can find in the New Testament that we can say, aha, there's some pieces of liturgy that we see, for example, the reading of the scrolls and things like that. But we would have to turn and find that out. But really the key there is every knee should bow at the name of God. And when God gives Yeshua His name, then every knee will bow because Yeshua bears God's name. So when did God give Yeshua His name?
Well, Yeshua says in Matthew 28, after He was resurrected from the dead, that all authority was given unto me, so that might be a clue right there, huh?
Well, okay, but then that means that sort of like Mordecai, that when the king Ahasuerus decides to reward Mordecai and puts him on his horse and has Haman lead him around the city, and everybody's supposed to bow now. Mordecai is sort of like bowing to Yeshua. It's not that Yeshua takes the place, not that Mordecai takes the place of Ahasuerus, and it's not that Yeshua takes the place of God. The giving of the name of God is found in John when Pilate hangs the sign over his head, and the Yud He Vav He is spelled out, and on that sign, when it says Yeshua HaMashiach V'Melech HaYehudim, and the Jews say in John, take it down. And Pilate says, I'm not going to change it.
I've written what I've written.
So why did they say take it down? Because of that symbology. So who was it that gave Yeshua the divine name? Pilate. Irony of all ironies.
I kind of wonder if Pilate himself did that subconsciously. I don't know.
It's very doubtful. I would think that the hand of God was upon those events. It's one of those events which is very, I'm trying to think of the word, perplexingly curious, I guess. So this psalm is considered to be a cantata in 12 parts. It's a collection of songs, considered by some. So the variety of motifs in this psalm that do not permit much concurrence. In other words, it seems to go a different direction, but it is a triumphal hymn. Some people consider that this psalm is a corrupt psalm, that it lacks coherence, etc. And there are serious problems within it. And I said there were two tendencies. One was to break it up, and the other one was to try to find its coherence, try to harmonize it. So the different elements are, there are visual depictions of scenes, there are divine statements and oracles, there are deeds that God has done, salvation deeds that God has done already, that have already taken place, that referred to here. And there are specific cultic operations as well as petitions and wishes in this psalm. Now that's a short summary. I could give you a longer summary, verse by verse, or collections of verses by collections of verses. But the point here is that it's very diverse. Now, I guess we should consider the setting, because the setting will give us more, I think, more coherence. So it is a song of victory, and people also look at it as a new eschatological exodus. So there's an interesting turn in this psalm that goes from one place to another place. So what are the places that are mentioned in the psalm? And where does it wind up?
It says he came from Sinai unto his sanctuary. It ends up in Mount
Okay, we go from Sinai, one mountain. Okay, there are other mountains mentioned in the psalm. Bashan, and there's another one. Zalman. Okay, and then eventually Mount Zion. So it's this tour of these mountains. And by the way, we don't know where Mount Zalman is. which that's referring to, but it's obviously a high mountain because it talks about the snow on there.
Not Mount Hermon by chance, huh?
You know, it would have been labeled that, so it's perplexing to the interpreters. Mount Bashan is in the Golan Heights, and it's a high mountain there.
She goes all the way to Syria.
Mm-hmm. And so, then there's a mountain that perhaps is not really mentioned here specifically, but maybe provide us with a setting. Is there a time in Jewish history, in a place in Jewish history, where a mighty battle was won and that it was a complete defeat of the enemy, even to the point of the king being defeated, and so it was a complete destruction of the forces against Israel, and it was fought by the tribes of Zebulun, Naphtali, and Issachar, although the Issachar is not mentioned, but so it was in the northern part of Israel during the time of the Judges, and there's another mountain that's not really mentioned here, but could be a setting. The time of the Judges, what was the great victory that was won?
The victory of Ai.
Oh.
That's in Joshua.
That's in Joshua, excuse me.
The time of the Judges, and a woman,
Oh,
prophet,
Deborah.
Yeah.
The mountain goat lady.
time of Deborah,
And lost something.
and her general's name was,
His race.
I forgot the general's name, but anyway, so that was a complete,
I'll tell
a
you.
complete
Baruch, huh? Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Baruch.
Barak, yeah,
Baruch.
and which means blessed, you know. So anyway, there was such a complete defeat of the enemy there. The Mount Tabor could be a place where this liturgy was first developed, as on Mount Tabor. So you would think that ancient peoples would celebrate their victories, and what they might have done is gone up on top of the Mount Tabor and celebrated the great power and victory of their God in the defeat of their enemies. But then, this original cultic location is taken under and subsumed into this larger picture, which is that the sanctuary does not reside on Mount Tabor, but it resides in Jerusalem. So the highest mountain, not literally, because Mount Moriah is not that high, but the high, or Mount Zion, but it's still a mountain there, is considered the highest because that is the place where God chose to dwell. And so the Jerusalem motif overtakes the motif of Mount Tabor and the local sanctuary where this psalm might have originated in celebrating the defeat of Sisera, and that's why Zebulun and Naphtali would be specifically mentioned. So there's two tribes from the southern that are mentioned, Benjamin and Yehuda, and then the two tribes in the north, only two are mentioned, Zebulun and Naphtali. But those were the tribes, two of the three tribes, which fought against Sisera in the north. So this is could be considered a festival of Epiphany of the God of Sinai. The same God who appeared on Sinai appeared now in this battle and defeated and crushed the enemy. So the beginning is a prayer for God's coming as a divine warrior. This is a kind of a vision where the epiphany of God is a warlike character. He is a divine warrior. So the covenantal community raises his voice in the beginning of this psalm to the Lord in his role as a divine warrior against the enemies. And the epiphany of God, the appearing of God in this manner, evokes joy, jubilation, and good fortune. So God's appearing does not instill dread on the righteous, but for the wicked, they are perishing, and they can only sit and wait for the divine warrior to come and avenge them, because they have done evil in his sight. So in verses 4 through 6, we have the prayer of the hopeful, righteous, that they may be glad, rejoice, and happy and joyful. They're going to sing and extol and rejoice because the divine warrior rides on the clouds. He brings salvation to the world and resides in his sanctuary. He saves. Now this is in verse 6. This is an interesting turn and a very ethical turn here, a very important one. He saves the forsaken and the imprisoned. So the difference in the world today between nations in the world, you find powerful nations like Russia, and the question is whether they are concerned for the forsaken and the imprisoned. And that's an issue that's come up in the Olympics, that they don't seem to be concerned only about their own glory. But here, the psalmist is saying that this is the very nature of God. When he appears as the divine warrior, he is also concerned for the lowly, the meek, the poor, etc., and so forth. And his salvation involves their restoration. So the psalmist is really, in verse 4, is stomping all over the God ball, because attributed to Baal are rain, fertility, and prosperity, and here it said is really coming from God, the God of Israel, and that he's the one who rides on the clouds. The clouds are his chariot. He races through the sky, bringing blessing and curse, vindication for the righteous, and vengeance against the unrighteous. He comes from his holy dwelling in 5 through 6, and his eyes are yet focused on the destitute and oppressed. So the language here in verses 4 through 6 is that God is a father, a defender, a restorer, a redeemer. That's why I said this is whiplash, because it's just the opposite of what we said last night. He is the one who's ever present and ever real for this psalmist. And that's why he is concerned for the fatherless, the widows, and the lonely, and the exiles. And he is concerned for oppressed people, whether or not they belong to the people of God. So he's concerned not just for Israel, the oppressed and poor of Israel, but of the entire world. It's very important for this fact or this thought to come out, because if he's really the God of the world and the universe and so forth, then he would not just be concerned for Israel, but those deprived of their rights around the world. But those who are deprived of their rights, when the divine warrior shows up, they will taste of the Lord's goodness in their vindication. This is what salvation is, according to this psalm. So it continues in verses 7 and beyond with a reflection of what the divine warrior is, and what he's done. The community reflects on the Lord's past acts in behalf of Israel. So the Exodus, the wilderness, is recalled. And God marches through the wilderness ahead of the people. The earth shakes as he comes through. The heavens pour down. And the idea of lightning and the storm, all these are crowded together in this psalm. So the divine warrior is seen as bringing about salvation history, and then establishing a rule eventually in Jerusalem. So his coming is awesome. So it goes from things that are sort of terrible and cause you to fear and have awe, rain, thunder, and lightning, quaking of the earth, and so forth, to a theme in verses 9 and 10 of abundant showers and water and manna, and showering the land of and bringing it back to what he intended for it. It's interesting in verses 11 and so forth that victory is announced and the hostile kings have to flee or they're crushed, and there's great booty, spoils, so forth. A dove covered with silver is mentioned. It's a symbol of love. And the men, interestingly enough, who stayed behind don't really share the spoils. Who shares the spoils? I guess we could do a little psychology on that. And in verse 14, the snow on Mount Solomon is mentioned. And it's winding its way down toward Jerusalem. And in verses 15 and forward, we are seeing the mountain of God is glorified, and the glorification of the highest mountain. So it's the establishment of God's presence in Jerusalem. So it turns from Mount Bashan to Mount Zion. So the Canaanites associated their dwelling place of their gods as the high and lofty mountains. And so this is another stomping on the Canaanite religion, because God now is taking over all of these mountains Basically, they're his now, not Baal's. So Mount Bashan is looking in envy at Mount Zion because the Lord has ultimately chose to establish his reign there. So this psalm really becomes, in this part, an ascension psalm where God ascends to the highest mountain, which is identical then to a heavenly seat. God is carried by a chariot and surrounded by the heavenly hosts. Adonai Tsevaot, Goaleinu. This is the divine warrior language that we use right before the Amidah. His majestic radiance blazes forth. But he does not come from the underworld like Baal does. So, if I want to tell you a little bit about Baal now, so you understand how this is differing from the Baalim. In the Canaanite religion, there's a legend of Baal and Anat. They're brothers, and Baal is the brother of Anat, and Anat is the sister of Baal. And Baal fights with Mot, death, and is defeated by death and taken down to the underworld through Mot's gullet. And Baal's sister Anat confronts Mot and defeats Mot in battle and secures release of her brother. So here we have in this psalm no idea about God coming from the underworld, but just riding around on the clouds. And that, so he is not like Baal, who can be defeated by another god. This is a stomping on the Baalim religion. And he, of course, is seen as being very powerful because of all of his victories that he's had. And he is bringing prisoners in train. That's where he talks about bringing people from Bashan and the depths of the sea. In other words, this is a picture of an ancient king bringing in tow all the prisoners that he has captured. So the entourage that follows the Lord is thousands of chariots. He's revealed in holiness, and he goes ahead of his people to protect and bless them. And after the victorious completion of the wilderness wanderings, in verse 18, the Lord returned as if to heaven. To celebrate his kingship on earth, the divine warrior has successfully subjugated the enemies, and he receives a tribute from the nations. So when he comes to earth, he chooses a place, Jerusalem among the mountains, to establish his abode, where the Lord himself will dwell forever. So the praise comes in verse 19 and 20 of the divine vindication. The assembly of the community is praising God for his vindication of them. It's not just a promised delivery and victory here, but it is one that has been won. This the master of the universe here is God our Savior. And his nature sets in motion the history of redemption because, in verse 20, our God is a God who saves. So for the believing community, God is the God. And L is repeated 3 times here. His rule extends over all the angels in heaven to all the earth. He is Lord Adonai. So the root, Yeshua, that we get the word Yeshua from, that same word for save is found in verse 19. God our Savior, a God who saves. Literally in verse 20, God of salvations.
Also notice in verse 19, this is translated God of our salvation, and in verse 20 it's God of salvation.
So here, God is seen above everything, and the spheres and the powers of the underworld are in the hands of the God of Israel. In other words, he's powerful even over the underworld. He's proved to be the powerful ruler by means of historical victories. So when Yeshua retreats to Caesarea Philippi after John the Baptist is beheaded, he makes a very profound proclamation at that site. And I think in our faith lessons class we might have a little video about that site. But Yeshua says these words, upon this rock. Now the question is, what is the rock? But we'll entertain that in the video. I will build my assembly, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Here is a statement by Yeshua that the underworld will not have power over his kingdom. It's the same as God being over the underworld. The underworld is no threat to him. Yes, Mark.
I think I remember seeing that video, not in the recent Michelle class, but when we did that class so many years ago.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. So God here is kind of seen as leading a processional, and he has daily vigilance over his people, and he is continually leading his people out of death, destruction, at the hands of enemies, and ultimately in the standing prayer of the Amida we say that he has power enough to raise the dead. So the same root word, which the Hebrew to go out, I don't exactly have the Hebrew word here, I guess I could look it up, is used for the Exodus in verse 7, but it's also used in verse 19 and 20 to the deliverance or escape from death, to go out from death. So here, Mot being death, the Canaanite god of death, the psalmist is proclaiming that is Israel's God. El is victorious over Mot, death. This is construed as a polemical note against the Canaanite mythology. course, we could say that this becomes a paramount proclamation for the followers of Yeshua, because Yeshua's resurrection demonstrates God's power over death. And then we go on in verses 21 through 23 with an oracle from the divine warrior, where the divine warrior is something is being said about what the divine warrior will do. Surely God will crush the heads of his enemies, the hairy crowns of those who go down on in their sins. The Lord says, I will bring them from Bashan, I will bring them from the depths of the sea, that you may plunge your feet in the blood of your foes, while the tongues of your dogs have their share. It's the more modern translation than the one that I read. This is war imagery of a complete victory. Although it's rather graphic and the hairy crowns would be the heads of the enemy, and those that have hated the Lord of the universe have committed shameful acts, and they cannot flee or hide from the unlimited power of God. God has unlimited reach, and He is the universal ruler of the world. That's right. So, the mighty opponents of God cannot even hide in the escarpments of the rock or hide in the sea. There's no place the Lord that they can hide. The Lord will bring them down. So this is the language of war and victory. Then in verse 24 through 35, we have a joyful anticipation of the divine warriors coming. The oracle that was just given inspires people with greater hope as they wait his procession. The psalmist here addresses God now in the first person rather than the collective person. And he calls him my King, my God and King. Previously in the psalm, it was the whole community bringing praise, but in this case, it turns to a personal one. The Lord is returning victoriously from his battle to his sanctuary, and now we have both corporate and personal praise of God. So his ascension and the entrance of God into the sanctuary is accompanied by singers, string players, and maidens playing timbrels. Choirs surround the entering of God with sounds of exaltation. The Epiphany of God is celebrated by all of Israel. All the princes and leaders of the tribes join in the singing of the victorious hymn. Even though only 4 are mentioned in the psalm, it's assumed that they are representative of the other tribes. That's why, when people would ascend to Jerusalem, Shir Hamalot, the song of ascents, is what the liturgy is. And as people came up to Jerusalem, they sang songs for the holidays. And as they entered the temple, they heard the Levitical choir singing. And this was all a sort of a reenactment of the ascension idea and the entrance of God in His sanctuary. This is followed by a petition in verses 28 and 29, a petition for God to display His power. And so one could think that after the northern kingdom fell, that this psalm would be a petition, could be seen as writing a petition for God to reassert Himself. The petition is to strike those nations that will not submit themselves to the Lord. The beast among the reeds could be seen as the great power on the banks of the Nile, like a crocodile in the Nile, or maybe a hippopotamus, which is even more dangerous than a crocodile.
I still find it surprising.
The bulls denote oppressors, troublers, and seducers of the nations. The nations that have loved warfare and tribute will be humbled. Even the mighty Egypt will submit to the Lord. So the psalm ends like a hymn. In the triumphal hymn in verses 32 through 35. So here we see an expansion of what we saw in verse 4. Verse 4 says, "Sing to God, sing praise to His name, and extol Him who rides on the clouds." So in 32 and 33 we say, the psalm says, "Sing to God, O kingdoms of the earth, sing praise to the Lord, to Him who rides the ancient skies above, who thunders with a mighty voice." So in verse 4 it's riding the clouds. In verse 33 it's to Him who rides the ancient skies. It shows the excellency of the Lord, and His rule extends throughout time to the highest heaven. The praise of the subject nations must include an ascription of God's sovereignty. So the emphasis here in verse 34 lies in the sovereignty and power of His rule. The Lord delivers the oppressed with justice and compassion. So as God passes along the heavens, He lifts up His reverberating voice like a God of thunder, and He rules fearfully from His sanctuary. And this song of praise closes the psalm. So the psalm is a stomping on the Canaanite religion. The Baal of heaven was considered Lord and King and giver of all fertility. But the God of Israel is not like Baal. He doesn't come from the underworld. His great deeds precede His ascension. And when he appears, great things happen. The Exodus, march through the desert, the distribution of the land, the great victory over Sisera. These are God's deeds. His ascension as a victor celebrate the Lord of history, King of the world. So this psalm is a running recital of these words that talk about victory. So it seems as if Paul somewhat alludes to this ascension kind of idea that may be similar to this psalm in Ephesians 4:8 and following. But there's a slight difference, and it doesn't quite fit. The same kind of idea pervades there. So we have the cosmic conqueror who comes and strikes the heads of his enemies. And this violent language in the psalm has become a metaphor for the completeness of God's power and the certainty of the defeat of his cosmic foes. The language of the theophany is extreme. The very holiness of God arriving in the human world of our sinful experience requires that language be stretched to its utmost, and that hyperbole is used. So the violent sections are drawn out, to make it demonstrate the great power of God. So the human language is ill-suited for describing God, and that's been somewhat controversial within Judaism. Some books and chapters of the Bible were not encouraged by the rabbis to be read because they felt like the language could not describe God. Ezekiel 1 is in that category. But the psalmist here is trying to bring the reader into an experience, not an understanding of God. An experience of God in this way would cause us to know the terrible, awesome, and fearsome, threatening Creator. And when we even talk about His coming, we somewhat lessen His power and impact. So there's excessive language in this psalm. When God comes, big things happen. The earth shakes, the rain pours down, thousands of divine chariots light up the sky. It's violent. And our modern sensibilities are offended that the wicked disappear like smoke, they're melted away. The bodies of the defeated lie like snow on the hills. God drags his defeated enemies from town to town for public display, and people dance on the blood of their enemies. But they describe actions of God whose power outstrip and nullify even the most violent efforts that human beings can sum up. So God responds in kind. Violent people wind up with a violent death. And that's why Yeshua said, Peter, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. So it's progressive. This psalm is also looking forward to an eschatological extreme. And that extreme would be the reappearance of God the Divine Warrior, which Mark has brought up, is found in the book of the Apocalypse, right? The Revelation. When Yahweh establishes, I shouldn't have said that. When God establishes his throne in his sanctuary, his kingdom will include the whole earth. The kings of the nations will submit to him. And so our paths ought to follow the same path. We come through the desert of our sin to the fruitful land of the kingdom of God. From the battles of the evil within that we fight, and the battles of evil without that we fight with other people, to the destruction of foes and submission to God's sovereignty. So it's very important to remember that we need to be submitted to God's sovereignty and not try to take things into our own hands. Just wait for the divine warrior to execute his justice.
Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord.
Very good. So it moves from, we need to be concerned about whether we're just selfishly concerned or whether we're coming together with the community to gather in praise in the sanctuary. So this is both a personal affirmation and a corporate affirmation. And the message here is God is leading his children along, and God will lead his children along. The end of the whiplash is now over.